Jimi Hendrix is back in the spotlight, but not for the reasons you might expect. This time, it's all because of Led Zeppelin. While it's no secret that Hendrix wasn't fond of the band, the real reason behind his feelings might just leave you speechless. So, what sparked this tension between two rock legends? Stick around as we uncover the truth behind Hendrix's surprising stance on Led Zeppelin. Background on Jimi Hendrix. Widely recognized as one of the most creative and influential musicians of the 20th century, Jimi Hendrix pioneered the explosive possibilities of the electric guitar. His use of fuzz, feedback, and controlled distortion gave birth to a completely new musical form. What makes his story even more remarkable? Hendrix couldn't read or write music, and yet his meteoric rise in the music world happened in just 4 short years. Hendrix's unique musical language continues to influence generations of musicians, from George Clinton to Miles Davis, and from Steve Vai to Johnny Lang. Born Johnny Allen Hendrix at 10:15 a.m. on November 27, 1942, at Seattle's King County Hospital, his name was later changed to James Marshall Hendrix when his father returned from the military. Hendrix's early life wasn't easy. He grew up with little money and even less attention from both parents. His parents divorced when he was just 9 years old, and he lost his mother at the age of 16. At around 14, Hendrix stumbled upon his first guitar, if you could even call it that. It was a broken broomstick with a single string, tossed away by another kid. Yet somehow, Hendrix still managed to play a few tunes on it. Not long after, at 15, he scraped together $5 to buy a proper acoustic guitar from a friend of his father. Then came his first electric guitar, a white Supro Ozark, a gift from his father, Al Hendrix. He had no lessons. He taught himself by watching legends like Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley perform. And yes, he played without an amplifier. Though he finished middle school, Hendrix never graduated from Garfield High School. In interviews during the late 1960s, Hendrix claimed racism and discrimination were behind his departure from school. Others suggested he simply struggled with grades and organization. Hendrix later mentioned he was kicked out for being rude to a teacher. Hendrix's early inspirations. When Hendrix was young, he was a huge fan of Elvis Presley. On September 1, 1957, he went to see Presley perform at Six Stadium. Inspired, he even drew a color picture of Elvis holding an acoustic guitar, a drawing that's now on display at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio. Even as an adult, Hendrix's admiration for Presley never faded. In late 1968, while in Paris, he watched the Elvis film King Creole to get inspired for his songwriting. But Hendrix's musical influences didn't stop there. He also loved blues legends like Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, and Lightnin' Hopkins. At one point, he played in the band of R&B superstar Little Richard, but their relationship wasn't exactly smooth. Richard didn't like Hendrix's flashy clothes, his constant lateness, or his habit of stealing the spotlight on stage. Before his music career took off, Hendrix got into trouble with the law, twice caught stealing cars. Given a choice between 2 years in prison or joining the U.S. Army, he chose the Army. On May 31, 1961, he was sent to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. But military life didn't suit him. His officers noted he often slept on duty and was more focused on his guitar than his assignments. One officer even said, "His mind apparently cannot function while performing duties and thinking about his guitar." Still, his time in the Army wasn't a total waste. It was there he met bassist Billy Cox, who would later become his bandmate in a group called the King Casuals. A year later, on May 31, 1962, Hendrix was discharged from the Army. Officially, it was due to his behavior and lack of discipline, but Hendrix later claimed he left after breaking his ankle during his 26th parachute jump. In interviews with Melody Maker magazine in 1967 and 1969, he said he didn't enjoy his time in the military and disagreed with their way of doing things. Interestingly, when interviewed in America, Hendrix rarely talked about his Army days, only briefly mentioning that he had been stationed at Fort Campbell. Hendrix's left-handed playing on a guitar designed for right-handed players instantly set him apart. His first real concert? It was with a small, unnamed band playing in a synagogue. Not long after, he joined a band called the Velvetones, a modest beginning that would eventually lead to giant leaps in music history. After leaving the Army, Hendrix and Billy Cox moved to Clarksville, Tennessee, where they performed with their group, the King Casuals. They played in small bars, but the money wasn't enough to make ends meet. So, the two relocated to Nashville, where they leaned into blues-style music. In November 1962, Hendrix had his first experience in a studio. Though the gigs in Nashville didn't pay well, they gave Hendrix valuable insight into how bands worked, and he gained experience both as a rhythm and lead guitarist, and sometimes as a vocalist. Eventually, Hendrix left Nashville and headed north to New York City. By January 1964, he had moved to Harlem, performing at bars and clubs to earn money. He even won first prize in an amateur guitar contest at the legendary Apollo Theater. In 1966, Hendrix formed a new band, Jimmy James and the Blue Flames. One of its members was none other than Little Richard, and another was a 15-year-old named Randy, a musician Hendrix had met while moving through the local scene. They played countless gigs across New York City, including regular performances at Café Wah, a hotspot for rising talent. That same year, Hendrix's path took a dramatic turn when he met Linda Keith, girlfriend of the Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards. She believed in Hendrix's talent and introduced him to Chas Chandler, manager of the Animals. Chandler was impressed and encouraged Hendrix to record a rock version of the song Hey Joe. Once Hendrix delivered, Chandler took him to London to sign a contract and start fresh. Now, needing a full band, Hendrix formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience with drummer Mitch Mitchell and bassist Noel Redding. The name was suggested by their business manager, Mike Jeffrey. By the fall of 1966, the Jimi Hendrix Experience had become the talk of London, igniting a musical storm that was just getting started. The Jimi Hendrix Experience. The Jimi Hendrix Experience released its debut album in 1967, titled Are You Experienced? While the album was being produced and sold, Hendrix toured across the UK and parts of Europe. On June 4, 1967, the band played their final London show before heading to America. Once stateside, Hendrix drew crowds of iconic musicians like Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and even Brian Epstein, who all came to see him perform. Are You Experienced quickly climbed the charts, reaching number 2 in the UK. Over time, its legacy only grew. In 2001, VH1 named it the 5th greatest album of all time, and in 2003, Rolling Stone ranked it 15th on their list of the 500 greatest albums ever made. Later that same year, Hendrix released his second album, Axis Bold as Love. This record featured now classic tracks, most notably Little Wing, a song that's since been covered by artists like Stevie Ray Vaughan, Metallica, Eric Clapton, Pearl Jam, Sting, and Henry Hank Marion. One major difference with this album was Hendrix's decision to tune his guitar down a half step, to E-flat, giving the songs a deeper, more expressive tone. Axis, Bold as Love peaked at number 3 in the US and number 5 in the UK, but the now iconic album In Fact almost never made it to stores. Hendrix lost the master tape for Side 1 in the back of a London taxi. He, Chas Chandler, and engineer Eddie Kramer had to remix the entire side in a single night. They struggled with If 6 Was 9, but fortunately, bassist Noel Redding had a backup copy. Although the album was well received, Hendrix felt it had been rushed and believed it could have been much better. By 1968, Hendrix began taking full control of his music. he became more involved in studio production, working the soundboard himself. Every knob turn and switch flip, fine-tuning his unique sound. Back in the US, he built his own recording space, Electric Lady Studios in New York City. This studio would become the birthplace of his most ambitious project yet, a double album called Electric Ladyland. Released in 1968, Electric Ladyland marked a turning point. Chas Chandler and Noel Redding both parted ways with Hendrix during this time, allowing him full creative freedom. Hendrix began experimenting heavily, mixing flutes, trombones, and heavily distorted guitars to create entirely new sonic textures. The album soared to #1 in the US and hit #5 in the UK. VH1 later ranked it the 72nd greatest album of all time, and Rolling Stone placed it at #54 on their list of the 500 greatest albums. But behind all the success, the constant grind of touring and studio sessions took its toll. By 1969, the Jimi Hendrix Experience had officially disbanded. That same summer, Hendrix entered a new era of personal and musical exploration. In August 1969, he performed at the legendary Woodstock Music and Art Fair with a new group called Gypsy, Sun and Rainbows. Alongside Mitch Mitchell, Billy Cox, Juma Sultan, and Jerry Velez, Hendrix delivered a powerful improvisational set, most famously his haunting, feedback-laden rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner, which electrified the festival's muddy crowd. Later that year, Hendrix launched another mind-blowing project titled Band of Gypsies. Teaming up with Billy Cox and drummer Buddy Miles of Electric Flag, the trio played a series of 4 New Year's concerts on December 31, 1969, and January 1, 1970. Recordings from these performances became the Band of Gypsies album, released in mid-1970, and were later expanded into Hendrix, Live at the Fillmore East in 1999. By 1970, Hendrix had reunited with drummer Mitch Mitchell, keeping Billy Cox on bass to form a revamped version of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. The trio began work on a new double album, tentatively titled First Rays of the New Rising Sun. Hendrix poured his energy into recording, crafting a bold new vision, one that fused all the lessons and styles he'd absorbed over the years. Tragically, Hendrix never saw the project through. A relentless touring schedule and mounting pressures took their toll, and on September 18, 1970, Jimi Hendrix passed away. He was just 27 years old. Fortunately, the unfinished recordings were preserved. With the help of Hendrix's family and longtime engineer Eddie Kramer, First Rays of the New Rising Sun was finally released in 1997, offering a glimpse into where Hendrix might have gone next. Over the span of a short but revolutionary career, Jimi Hendrix created a vast and timeless collection of music. Drawing from blues, rock, jazz, R&B, and ballads, his sound was unbound by genre and powered by imagination. Today, he remains one of the most iconic and influential artists in the history of rock music. Hendrix's Problem with Racism. It might seem odd to suggest that Hendrix's race was invisible to white fans. His skin color was one of his selling points when he made his American debut in 1967, with his performance at the Monterey Pop Festival in California. Hendrix was possibly the first black sex symbol that American whites unabashedly embraced. At a time when a black man could be killed for being with a white woman, Hendrix was surrounded by white groupies, flicking his tongue and grinding his guitar before thousands of cheering white girls. These adoring fans certainly noticed Hendrix's race, but what they saw was often a stereotype of the hypersexual black man that Hendrix himself played up for fame. The press of his day extended the stereotype further. Rolling Stone referred to him as a psychedelic super spade, and another magazine dubbed him the Wild Man of Borneo. However, few of these white fans knew how much Hendrix's life had been scarred by racism. According to Cross, his biographer Hendrix left his hometown of Seattle because of racism. He grew up in abject poverty and family turmoil, which was common for black families at the time. As a teenager, Hendrix was arrested on dubious charges of driving stolen cars and was given the choice of being jailed or enlisting in the army. He enlisted and became a paratrooper. Cross stated that what happened to Hendrix would have never happened to a white male during that era. He explained that Hendrix was essentially run out of Seattle because of his race. Hendrix continued to face racism throughout his career. When he toured the Chitlin circuit, he couldn't even use the bathroom at gas stations in the South because they refused to let blacks inside. Even after he became a rock star, he still faced racial profiling. Cross recalled instances of Hendrix being mistaken for a bellhop in a fancy New York hotel, and of New York cabbies refusing to pick him up. Even the warm reception Hendrix received when he went to London in 1966 for his big break was colored by racism. Various biographies noted that many of the white musicians he met had little experience with black people and struggled to accept Hendrix as a superior musician. Some of their resistance was rooted in ego as well as race. One infamous story told that Hendrix had to kill God before he was accepted in London. At the time, God was embodied by Eric Clapton, the guitarist for Cream, who was considered so skilled that a graffiti artist in London declared, "Clapton is God." When Hendrix arrived in London, he shocked onlookers by asking Clapton if he could join him on stage. Clapton agreed, and Hendrix launched into a blistering version of the blues classic Killing Floor. Clapton couldn't keep up and, humiliated, stormed off the stage afterward. Clapton later told Chaz Chandler, Hendrix's manager, that he had no idea Hendrix was this effing good. After Hendrix's death, some white fans still struggled with accepting his race, as Wells, a music critic, observed. He pointed out that heavy metal artists rarely mentioned Hendrix's race when they praised his guitar skills. They could appreciate his musical genius, but they had trouble acknowledging his heritage. Wells argued that this kind of adoration would not have pleased Hendrix. He explained that Hendrix didn't want to be known merely as a black musician, but at the same time, he didn't want to be denied his identity as a black musician either. Before his ill-fated Harlem concert, Hendrix explained to a New York Times reporter why he had returned to his old neighborhood. Hendrix remarked that sometimes when he visited, people would say he plays white rock for white people, and question what he was doing in that area. He responded that he wanted to show them that music was universal, and that there was no such thing as white rock or black rock. Hendrix's quest for acceptance among his own people was a lifelong journey. He initially tried to make a name for himself in black clubs on the Chitlin circuit, but his virtuoso guitar playing didn't align with the black popular music tastes of the time. According to Tate, a journalist, there was no place for Hendrix because black music at the time was focused on the style of singing, harmony, and production of Motown. Hendrix even tried to encourage black radio stations to play his music, but to no avail, says Cross, author of Room Full of Mirrors. Cross noted that it was deeply upsetting to Hendrix that he wasn't accepted by African-American radio stations. Hendrix didn't want to be confined by racial categories, but musical audiences were as segregated as the rest of America, Cross said. He explained that because Hendrix performed for white fans during the era of black power and separatism, many in the black community felt he had betrayed his own race by having a white band and playing for a primarily white audience. During the last 2 years of his life, Hendrix made a concerted effort to reach out to black audiences. He grew an afro, wrote protest-themed songs, and replaced his white bandmates with 2 black friends to form the Band of Gypsies. This group released a live album featuring Hendrix's classic, Machine Gun. The Band of Gypsies album hinted at a new musical direction for Hendrix. He had become friends with jazz musicians like Miles Davis, who encouraged him to experiment further. Hendrix was also experimenting with larger bands, adding percussion and recording music that blended jazz fusion and funk. he confided to friends that he was tired of the sexual showmanship and the persona of the psychedelic superspade. However, it would be a mistake to assume that Hendrix was on the verge of becoming a black militant. Some argue that Hendrix's racial identity, like his music, was ahead of its time. One clue to this might be found in a class picture of a young Hendrix, featured in David Henderson's biography, "Excuse Me While I Kiss the Sky." In this picture, a smiling, crew-cut Hendrix is surrounded by kids of all races: Japanese, Filipino, Native American, and white. Hendrix was raised in a multicultural environment. He even had Native American ancestry. Cross, Hendrix's biographer, noted that Hendrix's high school was one of the most integrated schools in America in the 1950s. He stated, "There was no school more diverse in America than Garfield High," and emphasized that Hendrix grew up in an environment where race was not considered a barrier to music or friendship. Today, at least some of the barriers to acknowledging Hendrix's blackness are beginning to come down. He has been sampled by hip-hop artists such as Public Enemy, A Tribe Called Quest, and Frank Ocean. Groups like the Black Rock Coalition now openly discuss Hendrix's influence, and genres like rock, punk, and metal are no longer seen as music solely for white men. Hendrix's drinking problems. Generally regarded as the greatest guitarist to ever live, Jimi Hendrix passed away too soon due to his addiction. After headlining the historic Woodstock Festival in 1969, the 27-year-old sensation suffered an accidental death from barbiturate-related asphyxia on September 18, 1970. According to Jimi's girlfriend, Monica Danneman, he had taken 9 Vesperax sleeping pills, which was 18 times the recommended dosage. While this amount was certainly grounds for a lethal drug overdose, it was reported that the famous addict choked to death on his own vomit, which primarily consisted of red wine. According to one book, Jimi had experimented with LSD, even while on stage at the Monterey Pop Festival. Dropping acid had become a regular occurrence on tour, and he quickly became associated with the hippie drug culture. He also used marijuana, hash, amphetamines, and cocaine regularly. When mixing these drugs with alcohol, he would often grow ill-tempered and violent. In fact, Jimi's addiction led him to drunkenly brawl at his hotel during a 1968 European tour. Not only did he injure his right hand, but he was also arrested and fined. Despite this, Jimi dismissed the clear evidence that addiction does not pay. 1969 was a difficult year for Jimi. He faced accusations of physically attacking several people. He was under the influence of both drugs and alcohol when he allegedly punched his friend Paul Caruso. Similarly, his addiction led to his girlfriend, Carmen Borrero, receiving stitches after Hendrix reportedly went on a drunken rage and hit her above her eye with a vodka bottle. Additionally, Jimi received drug possession charges while traveling through Toronto International Airport. Since his passing, Hendrix and his psychedelic guitar playing have become legendary. Numerous publications have ranked him as the most talented guitarist to ever pick up an axe. Labeled as the Guitar Event of the Year, the Experience Hendrix Tour is currently selling out arenas across the nation. At the show, prodigies such as Buddy Guy, Zakk Wylde, Eric Johnson, Dweezil Zappa, Kenny Wayne Shepherd, and Jimi's bassist Billy Cox performed to pay tribute to the greatest guitar player of all time. Hendrix left behind timeless music and a lasting influence over music, lovers, and musicians. One can only wonder how different the world of entertainment might be today had Hendrix overcome his addiction before that fateful night in 1970. What other mind-blowing instrumentals might he have played in front of thousands of concertgoers had he received drug and alcohol treatment? Unfortunately, Jimi remains another famous addict who tragically succumbed to alcohol and drug overdose. Who did Jimi Hendrix hate? While rock music has always sparked divided opinions, Jimi Hendrix stood as a rare unifying force who was respected by critics, fans, and fellow musicians alike. When he arrived in England, it took mere months for him to win over the biggest names in the scene. Members of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were quickly captivated, not just by his talent, but by the effortless charisma that came with it. What set Hendrix apart even further was his approach to others in the industry. He wasn't one to trash talk or start rivalries. Instead, he often shared kind words about his contemporaries, projecting humility despite his otherworldly skill. But behind his diplomatic public persona, Hendrix harbored strong opinions, especially about those he felt were less than genuine. Led Zeppelin, for example, was a band that left Hendrix cold. While the group was comprised of Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, and John Bonham. They rose to massive fame for their thunderous sound and technical prowess. Their legacy has long been entangled with controversy. Critics and musicians alike have pointed out how heavily Zeppelin drew from Black American blues, often without proper credit or acknowledgement. Unlike the Rolling Stones, who at least paid homage through covers and tributes, Led Zeppelin largely avoided publicly recognizing their musical influences. For Hendrix, Zeppelin's lack of transparency struck a nerve. While he never made a habit of airing these thoughts in public, he didn't shy away from speaking honestly in private. One such moment came to light years later in a 2006 interview with Carmine Appice, drummer of Vanilla Fudge. Appice recalled a personal conversation from the late 1960s where Hendrix admitted he wasn't a fan of Zeppelin. According to him, Jimmy referred to them as excess baggage and pointed out how they blatantly lifted material from other artists. He mentioned songs like You Shook Me, which had already appeared on Jeff Beck's record, and Dazed and Confused, which supposedly pulled elements from both Vanilla Fudge and Beck's Bolero. Even Good Times, Bad Times, Hendrix claimed, seemed to echo a bass line Tim Bogert once laid down. Still, Hendrix never used his public platform to tear others down. Maybe it was confidence. Maybe it was grace. Either way, he let his guitar do the talking, and it spoke louder than any criticism ever could. Appice, on the other hand, didn't see Zeppelin's borrowing as a big deal. To him, rock and roll had always thrived on cross-pollination. He recalled a moment with John Bonham that summed it up perfectly. When I first heard John do that triplet thing on the bass drum, I went up to him and said, "John, that's amazing! I think I stole that from you." And he goes, "What are you talking about? I took that from you." Appice was confused. He didn't remember doing anything like that. But Bonham pointed out a moment on the first Vanilla Fudge record where Appice had done it, just once. Bonham had caught it, ran with it, and turned it into something bigger. "We used to sit on the side of the stage and watch them play," Appice said. "We hung out in dressing rooms. We had a great relationship with Zeppelin." But Hendrix wasn't as forgiving. Robert Plant once told a story about how Hendrix teased Bonham to his face, mocking his double pedal technique. "You got a foot like a rabbit," Hendrix had joked. "We used to take the mickey out of people who used double bass drums." That same sense of skepticism colored Hendrix's view of Zeppelin overall. In a 1970 interview, when asked what he thought of the band, he shrugged, "I don't think much of Led Zeppelin. I don't think much about them." Even as he tried to walk it back, the apathy was loud and clear. Hendrix believed they were plundering American music without giving it the respect or credit it deserved. Still, he made a point to acknowledge Jimmy Page as a great guitarist. Sadly, the two never shared a stage. Page would later express regret about that missed opportunity. "I never saw him play either. I'm really upset with myself for never seeing him. I really wanted to hear him." Hendrix never got to witness the full evolution of Led Zeppelin. He passed away in 1970, just as they were beginning to grow into something beyond their early influences. Over the next decade, Zeppelin would shape a sound truly their own, less mimicry, more mastery. But by then, Hendrix was already gone, leaving behind a legacy untouched by imitation, and louder than any borrowed riff ever could be. Who else did Jimi Hendrix hate? While the 1960s may have been the age of superstar collaborations, it was far from a time of friendly camaraderie. The golden era of rock is filled with tales of rivalries, backstabbing, and the occasional drunken dust-up. Two towering figures of that era, Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison, embodied all three. But what caused the rift between them? Well, the answer can be traced back to a chaotic jam session in 1968. The Summer of Love was still in full swing when Hendrix and Morrison shared a stage at the iconic New York club, The Scene. But there was no peace and love that night, just tension, ego, and unpredictability. The room was packed with superstars. Janis Joplin was in the crowd, as were several other music legends. Lester Chambers, vocalist of the Chambers Brothers, later recalled how his band would finish their set at the nearby Cheetah Club and stroll over to the scene. He described the venue as a small, intimate space where you could rub shoulders with names like John Lennon, Johnny Winter, Buddy Miles, and Al Kooper. If Janis were in town, she'd be there too. Once the final act wrapped up, the vibe shifted. Waitresses cleared the tables, sending suburban patrons back to their cars, while musicians retreated to the dressing rooms to unwind. But that was when the real action began. One by one, the performers would gravitate back to the stage, kicking off impromptu jam sessions that felt electric, raw, unfiltered, and utterly unpredictable. Hendrix was a regular presence in those after-hours moments, often grabbing his guitar and jumping in. On this particular night, Hendrix had just taken to the stage when Jim Morrison stormed in, visibly drunk, and, by all accounts, spoiling for a confrontation. Audience member Michael J. Weber would later recall that Morrison appeared extremely intoxicated. No one was quite sure what he was on, and was slurring his words. According to Weber, Morrison had a confrontational energy about him, the kind of guy who got in your face. But then again, Weber said that sort of vibe was almost expected in that scene. Still, Morrison's abrasive personality clashed with Hendrix's more laid-back energy. Weber observed that Hendrix seemed to immediately take a dislike to Morrison. He explained that Hendrix had a calm, gentle demeanor, and was soft-spoken, even when conversing with women. Morrison, on the other hand, was brash and unapologetic, saying whatever was on his mind without hesitation or concern for others. That night set the stage for a relationship that would never be cordial. Hendrix, known for his grace and subtlety, likely saw Morrison's wild antics as the chaos he preferred to avoid. Meanwhile, Morrison may have perceived Hendrix's cool, composed vibe as a challenge. Regardless of the cause, the friction between them was undeniable as well as unforgettable. Before he even had a chance to buy a drink, Morrison swaggered over to Janis Joplin, took a seat next to her, and proceeded to pull her hair down to the floor. In response, Joplin is said to have grabbed a bottle of Southern Comfort from the table and smashed it against Morrison's bulk. Unscathed, Morrison climbed onto the stage where Hendrix and the others were jamming and began wailing, though he was completely incapable of holding a tune in his drunken state. Chambers remembered that Morrison was so drunk he had to hold on to the mic stand for support. Occasionally, Morrison would emit a string of garbled sounds, to which Hendrix humorously remarked, "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the sound of Jim Morrison." Refusing to let Hendrix have the last laugh, Morrison attempted an even cruder move. He dropped to his knees and gave Hendrix a mock blowjob. Fields, an Elektra Records publicist who witnessed the event, recalled that Morrison wrapped his arms around Hendrix's legs and loudly screamed, "I want to suck you." The scene was so outrageous that even though Hendrix was still trying to play, Morrison wouldn't let go. Fields noted that it was a tasteless attempt to steal the spotlight, something Morrison was known for. To make matters even more absurd, Joplin, who had been sitting at the back of the room, suddenly appeared at the edge of the stage, drink in hand, seemingly ready to intervene. The chaotic performance ended with the three musicians tumbling into a heap on the floor. Hendrix going for Morrison, Morrison swinging at Joplin, and vice versa. In the end, they had to be forcibly removed from the stage. As expected, Morrison bore the brunt of the chaos, suffering the full force of Hendrix and Joplin's fists. It was a clear case of what happens when the focus shifts from the music to personal drama. Growing up, did you see Jimi Hendrix perform live? And which of Hendrix's performances is your favorite to this day? Share your thoughts with us in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Also, click the following video on your screen and
You will enjoy it.